fix global warming with, which is nuclear power. Why is it you're not just putting up nuclear power everywhere? Now, I'm actually not arguing for that because economically, nuclear power is not very advantageous. But if you think this is the end of the world, I wonder why it is that you would be arguing, let's do the policies that haven't worked for the last 30 years. Let's put up solar panels, wind turbines that cover a couple of % of the world's energy consumption, and that may by 2040 cover maybe even 4, maybe even 5% of that energy consumption. If you're really worried about it, you would be using the technologies that would actually work. And the fact that you don't also kind of belies that even though you talk a lot about these end of the world scenarios, you don't quite believe them because you'd be a lot more focused on solutions.
You also make the point in the introduction that when you ask people by poll how concerned they are about global warming, there's many people, like a majority of people, if I remember correctly, who are very concerned about global warming. But if you ask them how much they would be willing to spend to ameliorate it, I think the average American agreed to spend $24, if I remember correctly from your book. And so then the problem then is by pointing that out, you belie your other claim, which is that you want to take people at face value. Now, you've got a real problem in that situation because you can take them at face value with regards to their explicit claims about what they're afraid of, which is global warming, but then equally explicitly, they tell you they don't want to spend any money on it. And so then you have to wonder, well, which of those two competing claims do you actually believe? I would tend to go with the one that saying that you're afraid of global warming has zero cost. Spending money on it has a cost, obviously. So the thing is, as soon as you put a cost to it, then you find out that people don't appear to believe it. They're not concerned. So the question then is, well, what does saying that they're concerned about buy them? And it might be something like, well, this is again not a particularly original thought, but it's moral virtue to advertise that I'm the sort of person who's intelligent enough to conceptualize global concerns and empathic and noble enough to be concerned by them. And then you say, well, what are you doing about it? And the answer is, well, I'm not doing anything. And then you say, well, then I don't buy your claim, but that's pretty rude. And two people who get together who are both concerned about global warming aren't going to be criticizing each other's lack of diligent attention to the sacrifices. They can just embrace one another. And I'm not being entirely cynical about that. I know why people advertise virtue, and people are relatively virtuous, and so it's not such a terrible thing to advertise it. But it does seem to interfere in this particular situation with practical movement forward. Now, one of the things you drive home continually is that there are real costs to getting this wrong. The costs are the money spent and what that money could have been spent on instead. So maybe you could make a case for everyone who's watching. What do you see as the proper set of priorities? Where do we as a species get the most bang for the buck with regards to these international problems? What are the top 10 things we should be concentrating on?
Yeah. So absolutely. Just to give you a sense of the $24 you were just talking about before, that people are not willing to spend very much. I think that's one of the reasons why, for instance, a carbon tax is so hard to do. Carbon tax is one of the smart solutions for climate change, but it also makes it very explicit that you're spending lots of money. So instead, what most people support is that we should be subsidizing green energy, that we should be subsidizing electric cars, that we should be doing a lot of other things that make you feel virtuous. It doesn't feel like it costs all that much, but it actually ends up costing huge amounts of resources. So while people saying they're not willing to spend very much, their sentiment actually allows politics to end up spending huge amounts of money. So this really matters. So sorry, you asked me, what are the things we should be spending our resources on?
And so that also means, what are we sacrificing if we concentrate too much on the moral virtue of driving a Tesla, for example, which is a clear status symbol, very expensive and not obviously related to ameliorating climate change? What are we sacrificing?
So as long as we are driving this Tesla, because the government, and that's typically almost everywhere in the world, because the government has spent $5,000 or $10,000 on subsidizing us in order to make us afford to drive this Tesla. That's $10,000 that couldn't go to other things either in our own states, our own nations, where we obviously could have spent it according to what the political decision-making process would decide, on better education and better care for our elderly, on better COVID care. Right now, there are lots of other things that are demanding attention. But what we tried to look at was, where could you spend this globally? And I'm going to talk about a few things because I'm sure we can get back to more of them. So one of the things that we talked about was free trade. So free trade, we know, is one of the reasons why almost everyone has gotten rich. The basic point is that instead of me trying to do everything, I specialize. I do one thing, and then I have a baker bake my bread. I have a butcher do my meat if I'm not vegetarian, and you do all these other things, and you have all these specialists doing it. Having it on an international scale means even more opportunity to have smarter people do what they do best for everyone else. And that's why we've gotten rich. That's why China has lifted about, 700 million people out of absolute poverty over the last 30 years, which is one of the biggest achievements in the world. It's impossible not to be very, very impressive just simply on the humanity of that project. And of course, we should be doing more of that. But unfortunately, we have, for a variety of reasons, Trump is obviously a big part of this, but it started way before Trump. The resentment towards free trade, the sense that this was wrong, has not only meant that many people in the rich world has become less better off than they otherwise could have been, but it's also meant that we have left a lot of people, especially in Africa and South Asia, much less well off. We should be spending some of our resources on making sure that we get more free trade, not less free trade.
How do we do that? How do we do that effectively?
And the simple way that we do that, unfortunately, is by subsidizing agriculture. So one of the most vested interests against free trade has turned out to be agriculture. It's agriculture in the EU and the US, Japan, many other places, because they don't want to have that competition. Look, from a private point of view, I understand that. If I was a farmer, I wouldn't want, cheap agricultural produce come in and essentially eradicate my business model. So we need to recognize that we need to subsidize these people. We probably also need to subsidize other people, the people who would otherwise have lost their jobs. So there's an enormous amount of money that needs to be spent.
Okay,
but
so